Tax accountant Sergei Magnitsky exposed a tax evasion scheme that defrauded the Russian Federation's budget of billions of dollars. Instead of a reward, Mr. Magnitsky was locked into a dirty prison cell, where he died in 2008. Russian law enforcement was not interested in investigating the circumstances of Mr. Magnitsky's death. British investor Bill Browder initiated an international investigation. The case was heard by the US Congress. And in 2012, the Magnitsky Act was passed, introducing personal sanctions against officials linked to Sergei's death and bureaucrats involved in the corruption scheme he'd unveiled. The officials' assets in the US territories were frozen, and they were denied travel rights to the country. In retaliation, the State Duma immediately passed the so-called Dima-Yakolev law, banning the adoption of Russian orphans by Americans. Increasing tension moved the case into the political realm, but greed was stronger than fear. The gang of high-ranking officials continued their outrageous dirty business, leaving behind gaping holes in the budget, dead bodies, and broken lives. Russian Untouchables, new victims. It was worth it. A few broken lives in exchange for a decisive end to Sergei Magnitsky's and Bill Browder's investigations. The task was to clear the names of the officials involved in the theft of billions. The ends justified the means. At least that's what the heads of the investigative committee thought at the moment.
The episodes of V.A.T. embezzlement exposed by Magnitsky were just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, it was and still is an everyday routine. In 2008, the 5.5 billion rubles that were stolen from the budget seemed like an astronomical amount of money, but it was only a minor episode. During those years, these same officials just as easily appropriated even bigger sums, cheating not only on income taxes, but also refunding V.A.Ts to suspicious companies.
What is Tax Inspectorate number 28 famous for? It is well known because 1 year before my work there, lawyer Sergei Magnitsky inspected it and exposed a stolen sum of 5.5 billion rubles. I came to examine this agency exactly a year later and discovered the same stolen amount with participation of exactly the same officials. You may recall that at the time, our law enforcement authorities insisted that the case exposed by Magnitsky was in reality a crime that he himself had committed. That is, that he himself had stolen tax money and then began screaming about it. But, in fact, a later episode of V.A.T. embezzlement proved that everything Magnitsky had said was true. The very same people that he had accused of fraud perpetrated similar thefts a year and 2 years after his death. Generally speaking, we must admit that if law enforcement officials had heeded the calls of Magnitsky and his friends and colleagues, not only would it have saved several lives, but perhaps also billions or even dozens of billions of rubles could have been saved in the national budget. In regards to the reaction of law enforcement, Novaya Gazeta does not generally send requests to law enforcement requesting investigations. We as journalists are called on to record history, and it is the task of society to react somehow to our signals. Law enforcement did react, though in a very strange manner. I was summoned several times and was interrogated on both cases, that of Magnitsky and of V.A.T. theft. These consisted of both official interrogations and what they called unofficial interviews, when they inquired as to what documents I possessed related to these cases and about my personal opinion of the case. As a matter of fact, I told them the same thing that I'm telling you now. As for the documents, I eagerly shared them, but judging by the results, neither my documents nor my opinion were of much use for my interrogators.
In order to understand the grand scale of pervasive corruption, let us consider the scheme of refunding V.A.T. in the Russian Federation. Our example comes from a criminal case that has already been decided in court. During 2009 and 2010, 11 companies filed V.A.T. refund claims to Moscow District Tax Inspectorates numbers 25, 28, and 15 for the amount of 5.15 billion rubles, For unsold imported consumer goods, tax officials had to initiate a series of inspection procedures. District police departments were supposed to render their support, performing tasks like checking the actual validity of legal addresses and unsold stock in trade. Certificates of inspection were to be signed personally by the heads of the district police departments. In addition, tax authorities have their own control mechanisms. Inquiries to tax inspectorates at the contractor's place of registration. In our case, there were 30 of them, and all of them approved of the operation. They all returned positive reviews, and no questions were raised about the legality of the transactions, causing enormous amounts of V.A.T refunds by anyone in the verification chain. Dozens of officials were in a position to stop the dubious transactions, but they never did so. With the approval of all the verification procedures in place, the declarations were sent for the approval by the Federal State Tax Directorate of Moscow. The deal was done and endorsed by the signature of the Chief Tax Officer of Moscow, Nadezhda Sinikova. After that, the district tax directorates delivered instructions to the Treasury to refund the astronomical sums. At this moment, the transactions became visible to top officials in the Russian Federal Tax Service, the Finance Ministry, the K Department of the Russian FSB, and the General Administration for Economic Security and Combating Corruption. Nevertheless, it went through. No one bothered to probe into 5,150,000,000 rubles drifting away from the state budget into the accounts of some totally obscure officials. The money traveled via Sberbank, which is state-owned, Benefit Bank, and Alpha Bank, into the accounts of some fly-by-night companies, and finally disappeared somewhere in Latvia, Turkey, Czech Republic, and Cyprus.
All the local tax officials at the grassroots level, of course, realized that it was a sheer fraud. They could not fail to see it, because it was their duty to carry out office audits and cross-checks, any of which would have quickly revealed the sham nature of such companies, because the staff of these companies commonly consisted of one person, and they had no assets, equipment, or goods whatsoever. Nothing. Now, let's take a look at the matter from the level of Madame Sinikova. Could she possibly have remained unaware? Of course. She can say that it was her negligent subordinates who were to blame. It was they who prepared and signed the documents, and she signed after them, only realizing later that she was deceived and that it had been a fraud. In which case, it's hard to escape two conclusions. First, Sinikova should be fired for letting her subordinates deceive her, and her staff should be brought to criminal justice. On the second conclusion, she knew about it and covered it up. Why do I opt for the second conclusion? The reason is simple. When Nadezhda Sinikova left the Moscow Federal Tax Service Directorate and joined Rosoboronpostavka, federal agency in charge of defense procurement, all her former subordinates from Tax Services Directorate number 28 followed and joined her at Rosoboronpostavka.
Let us now try to consider the scale of the transaction that was approved by hundreds of officials. 5.15 billion rubles, at an average exchange rate 30 rubles for $1, would make $183 million, or 18% VAT on goods worth $1 billion. The average invoice cost of one big truck with goods is around $50,000. That means that some 20,000 trucks full of consumer goods had gone missing in Moscow. A parking site for one truck occupies around 5 times 20 square meters, 100 square meters. 20,000 big trucks would occupy an area of 2 million square meters, roughly equivalent to 285 soccer pitches. So, that means hundreds of tax officials and police officers allegedly inspected, or rather allegedly overlooked, 285 soccer pitches full of big trucks loaded with goods.
They tried to lure my audit company into one of such schemes. For more than 10 years, I was the chief financial officer for such major steel mills as Gaiski Mining and Ore Processing Plant, and later Stupino Steel Mills. I successfully prepared Stupino Steel Mills for transfer to state control. I consider this success the greatest achievement of my career. Also, during all of these years, I continued to lecture on finance. I was slightly over 35 years old at that time and felt capable of starting my own business. I established an audit company called Walter Walls and invited the best auditors and accountants. My former employers and partners from the metals industry entrusted me with serving their businesses. My ambition at the time was to create a giant Russian audit company along the lines of Ernst & Young. The Moscow-based company, Mostovsvetmet, scrap metal plant, would play a fatal role in my endeavors. The head of the company, Andrei Bruyevich, was initially a great support to me. He offered me an office space while my office on Malaya Gruzinkaya Street was under renovation. At the time, I took it as a very kind gesture, but it turned out to be just a trap. A while later, he asked me to audit 2 of his companies and prepare tax returns for them. He delivered a truckload of documents to our office, and after 2 months of scrutinizing them, our accountants realized that these companies were claiming a V.A.T refund of over 1 billion rubles. The lack of transparency of their economic activities was a cause of major suspicion for us. Even in working for major industrial giants, I had never before seen such enormous sums of money. I decided to quit and asked Bruyevich to take his documents back. I never thought of whistleblowing on him, knowing I would simply be killed if I did. This was the only way out for me, just to quit, and I promised him to keep silent about the affair. But my decision was not met with understanding, and I began to face major pressure. Bruyevich demanded that we complete the job. I now saw a very different side of Andrei that I did not know before. He sternly warned me that I didn't realize whom I was dealing with, because the job was contracted by very serious people and there was no option for me. But I simply could not do that. I still believed then that I would be able to get off the hook, but I underestimated the scale of the menace. To be a manager, even a top manager behind powerful tycoons like Deripaska and Makhmudov, is very different from becoming a businessman on your own. When it became clear that I would not give in and would not manufacture fraudulent documents, they brought in the big guns. One day, a mass police squad burst into my office accompanied by a TV crew. They threw everyone face down on the floor and took away all the computers and documents. I was not detained that time and watched all this on the news that night. Soon, the case against me was closed for lack of evidence, but my business reputation was irreparably ruined.
Sergei Danilochkin's business was eventually ruined, but it was only the beginning of his ordeal. Mostovsvetmet owner Andrei Bruyevich kept insisting on proceeding with filing tax declarations. He explicitly let Sergei understand that some high-ranking people behind this operation were beginning to lose patience.
But I felt its negative effects on my health for many years. I survived, but fear never left me. I had to hire security, but it didn't save me. My residence in central Tverskaya Street was well guarded, and armed security would escort me to the entrance. One night, I walked by the concierge and called the elevator. There was no one around, when suddenly 2 thugs came out of thin air. When they tried to force me into the elevator, I saw a knife in one of their hands. Thanks to an athletic reaction on my part, I managed to protect my heart, and the knife went into my left hand. With my right hand, I grabbed my gun and tried to shoot. A fight occurred. I survived again, and the police placed me under a witness protection program. 3 uniformed machine gun policemen now stayed with me around the clock. There was no way of proceeding with my business any longer. I could not meet with my clients, and staff began to leave my company. Post-traumatic syndrome brought my nerves to the verge of breakdown. One night, in November 2010, I got my stuff together and left Russia for good.
The tension around the corruption scandal was mounting. Bill Browder published details of the embezzlement scheme and of the multi-million wealth of top tax officials. His Russian Untouchables website was soon blocked in Russia. But 4 episodes of a documentary investigation with this name can still be found on the internet. The British investor became Putin's enemy #1 and wrote a book, Red Notice, on these events. Browder began attending international events and kept asking tough questions in front of dozens of TV cameras.
$230 million was stolen from the Russian government by officials in the Magnitsky case. Magnitsky was murdered. Nobody's ever been charged with a crime. Why? You're fighting for money.
Right.
I don't think I can give a full answer as to why, if the funds were stolen, nobody was sentenced for Magnitsky's death. I can only state that if any people were to blame for the death of Magnitsky, but were not prosecuted under the relevant criminal laws and sentenced, it's a sheer outrage and bad. I mean, the issues revealed by Mr. Magnitsky concerning tax authorities' involvement with criminal groups, etc. Today, Mr. Mishustin, who is in charge of the Federal Tax Service, succeeded in making it one of the best administrative systems in the field of taxation, and this has been recognized by society.
This seems to be a very dubious statement. Concerning the V.A.T. embezzlement case, at least one episode of an illegal V.A.T. refund of 150 million rubles by Alder Company occurred after Mikhail Mishustin had already succeeded Antony Serdyakov in the office of Federal Tax Service Director.
I am not in a position to provide more details because I do not know them. In fact, I don't even know whether anybody was in fact convicted.
It is true that some people have in fact been sentenced, but instead of high-ranking officials, their places in jail have been occupied by scapegoats.
Instead of investigating these crimes in earnest, the FSB officers, specifically from its K department, were busy covering up the real criminals and trying to clear them of responsibility.
Responsibility was avoided by providing a few formal documents. The chief of the Russian FSB K department, Colonel Dmitry Stroitelev, reported to the investigation committee that they'd failed to trace the whereabouts of Olga Stepanova, head of the Tax Service Directorate number 28. This is very strange. At the time, because of the Magnitsky case, the address of Stepanova's luxurious mansion was available in the country. Instead of Stepanova, the police arrested her deputy, Olga Tsimai. But they soon changed her status from suspect to witness. In Tax Service Directorate number 25, the claims for V.A.T. refunds were signed by the deputy head, Sergei Zemchuznikov. Here is the report of his interrogation. Stepanova forged records of inspections, drawing interest of the Interior Ministry. Meanwhile, Zemchuznikov, according to his personal evidence, carried out the verification procedure all by himself. Though he was directly involved in embezzling 1.5 billion rubles, the investigators didn't consider him a suspect either. There were about 20 high-position functionaries on the board of the Federal Tax Service Directorate for Moscow who approved decisions on the V.A.T. refund. Every one of them was interrogated by asking carbon copy questions, and then the police let them go. One more striking detail. As an expert witness on the economics of this grand-scale fraud, investigators used a person without specific training who had only completed a 72-hour accounting class.
Those implicated in this case are functionaries of second and perhaps third echelon of the Russian power. That is, they are not people at the very top. That said, why do you think that the Russian authorities are so stubbornly trying to protect them?
This is the most important and frequently asked question. It might not be a big problem simply to arrest and convict a handful of some 15 bureaucrats. There are two explanations. This small group is not like a carrot, which is easily pulled out of the ground.
Metastasis.
First, they are the heart of the Interior Ministry, a core of the system, which cannot be simply pulled out. Second, it is very likely that those people might be behind schemes similar to those revealed by Magnitsky. There is also a conspiracy theory to which I am beginning to subscribe more and more. It is highly unlikely that these people are acting all by themselves when they so easily grabbed $5 billion at one go, prompting the conclusion that they must have had accomplices and patrons in power structures.
Путин был одним из бенефициаров тех $230 миллионов, которые раскрыл Сергей Магнитский и за которые он был убит. Неизвестно, какая точно доля этих денег идет Путину. Он просит людей в своем окружении совершать серьезные преступления от своего лица, арестовывать людей, сажать их в тюрьму, подвергать пыткам, в некоторых случаях убивать.
A severe sentence was imposed on Bill Browder himself. Nobody cared to examine the evidence he presented against high-ranking embezzlers. Instead, the Moscow Tverskoy court tried the world-renowned investor twice in absentia and sentenced him to 2 9-year prison terms. Russia has repeatedly included Bill Browder in the international Interpol wanted list. But the world community stood up for his protection, and he has been traveling around the globe without restrictions.
От 11 июля 2013 года Зэч Браудеру окончательное наказание лишения свободы сроком на 9 лет с удвоенным наказанием с практикованием общего режима. Взыскать солидарность Браудера Вильяма Феликса и Черкасова Ивана Сергеевича в пользу бюджета Российской Федерации 4 миллиарда 268 миллионов 84 тысячи 561 рубль 9 копеек в счет компенсации, в счет возмещения имущественного вреда.
The fate of the scapegoats, being far less significant, was far worse than that of the world-renowned financier. 2 young generals, Denis Sugrabov and Denis Nikandrov, were entrusted with the investigation of the V.A.T. refund case. There was even a prevailing feeling that the corrupt officials would meet retribution at any moment. However, 2 minor staff employees of the Walter Walls audit company were arrested instead. One of them, an elderly lady, was arrested by a police special task force by placing a bag over her head, as if she was a dangerous bandit. Later, she was subjected to hours of uninterrupted interrogation.
My wife and I wandered about small towns of Europe and practically never left home. In 2013, I was startled to learn from the media that I was referred to as a hardcore criminal. It was all a blatant lie. I read newspapers and couldn't believe my eyes. I was successful and, I believe, a respected professional. I combined positions of being a top manager, as well as a professor having published my academic writing. I never had time to look for candidates to be placed in charge of flight-by-night companies. But, of course, I was no longer able to respond to these absurd accusations.
All of this is total nonsense. He could not possibly have masterminded those schemes. He just couldn't. I cannot be certain of this exact role, so I'm only speculating. He could render certain auditing or accounting services to people who were engaged in these schemes, but he could not be the mastermind and leader of these organized groups, simply because his status was far below that level. The actual leaders' positions were much higher, and it is they who should be on trial.
During those fugitive years, we had a baby and our life became even more reserved. I realized there was no chance to survive, standing in the way of the former head of the Russian Federal Tax Service, Anatoly Serdyukov's associates. I didn't care that I was slandered and that all the power of the law enforcement system was thrown at me by orders of high-ranking criminals whose names came to the fore owing to Sergei Magnitsky's exposures. I was anxious to simply stay alive. Secret Service agents succeeded in periodically finding me in the most remote locations. They offered me complete impunity in exchange for coming back to Russia. But I dreaded the idea of repeating the fate of Magnitsky. I had nothing to conceal and nothing to reveal. I knew neither the officials involved nor their schemes. Sometime later, I learned that Andrei Bruyevich had been killed. I used to think that it was him who had ruined my life, but after his murder, I realized that he was no more than a mere pawn in the enormous criminal monster mechanism.
Наемный убийца на преступление, как считают следователи, скорее всего, заказное, поджидал Андрея Бруевича недалеко от его дома. Предприниматель на своей машине остановился на светофоре. В этот момент к автомобилю подбежал неизвестный и 8 раз нажал на курок пистолета ТТ. Бруевич скончался на месте, а его пассажир получил тяжелое ранение. Пострадавший Муслим Албастов сейчас находится в институте Склифосовского. У него ранение плеча.
Colonel Zabednov also died under mysterious circumstances. He had tried to help me. It was he who once told me that I had a chance to stay alive only if I disappeared, since my refusal to cooperate enraged very high-ranking and powerful people. This series of deaths forced me to move on. My family came to America and asked for political asylum.
Meanwhile, prosecutors were clearly in a hurry at Danilochkin's show trial. By the time the case was filed in court, the powerful generals Sugrabov and Nikandrov, who'd fabricated the case against Walter Walls, were already behind bars. The former was sentenced to a 17-year term on corruption charges, and the latter was detained red-handed when he received a bribe from a famous criminal, Shakro the Young. Sugrabov's deputy general, Boris Kolesnikov, died under mysterious circumstances. He was summoned to the investigation committee, arrested there and put into pretrial prison. During one of the interrogations, he allegedly jumped from the 6th floor window. Law enforcement's war was in full force. The powerful generals were defeated, but there was no way to check the spiral of persecutions they launched against auditor Danilochkin. His case was tried in the Presnesky District Court by Judge Evgeny Naidenov. The judge was not disturbed by the fact that none of the witnesses had ever even heard the name of Danilochkin.
Do you know Danilochkin?
No, at least I don't remember.
Have you heard the name of Danilochkin?
No, I haven't.
When they referred the case to the court, they swore by all that is holy that they would help. But nobody gives a damn now. In the meantime, I will be taking it on the chin every week for sure.
All motions by the defense were rejected. The prosecutor babbled the charges indistinctly, and the public was listed from the courtroom.
The prosecutor babbled something in a manner we couldn't possibly discern, so indistinctively.
Что известно вам с данного договора? Я не по своему личному просмотру поручения знакомства, когда мне купит договор, поставлен на 35 от 25 октября года, могу пояснить, что заключение данного договора.
When one of the witnesses asked the prosecutor to read the sentence a little louder, everyone present was kicked out of the courtroom.
Get out of the courtroom.
Why?
Just because.
I can make nothing of what's going on, who is being tried, and whom to believe.
Some scapegoats were tried. They were not present in the dock. Everything is staged as a mere formality. The judge was surprised someone took any interest at all. I was immediately thrown out of the courtroom. They usually bring to trial only some fall guys, commonly called scapegoats. The big fish, like Serdyakov, were waited out at Vasilyev's 13-room apartment for a couple of years, and sometime later would come back to some government job.
Totally incomprehensible. We had a feeling that the proceedings followed a pre-approved script. The judge would leave the room and come back. In a mere 5 minutes, he already had reached a verdict.
The case of auditor Danilochkin stirred up society. Court hearings were accompanied by youth protests, which inevitably ended in more detentions.
Detain them all.
Why so impolite with ladies?
Take them all down and get them in there.
Let us collect our things.
3 of them, this way.
We are getting out of here. We're leaving. Why are you pulling me?
Свободу, Данилович.
Even if we forget about the total absence of evidence in the Danilochkin case, the role of Walter Wall's company compared to the overall scale of the committed crime can be found in this. 2 out of the 11 that received VAT compensation tried to prepare declarations through the auditors. The company never asked for or received any compensation. And it would be unimaginable to assume that these insignificant companies ruled the giant mechanism consisting of the Federal Tax Service, the FSB, the Interior Ministry, and the Finance Ministry. However, the Presnetsky court found Danilochkin guilty and sentenced him to 10 years imprisonment in absentia. But they delayed issuing the sentence by a whole 2 months. When we succeeded in getting hold of the sentencing document, it became at once clear why the court was afraid to publish it in the face of public protests. As analysts predicted, not a single tax official involved in the organized criminal group was identified.
Those convicted were just scapegoats, while the actual beneficiaries and chief conspirators were removed from the case. Notably, I wish to emphasize that the real reason was not the police's failure to trace them. Rather, they were covered up intentionally, because, as far as I know, there was evidence against Stepanova and her other colleagues from the tax directorates at the early stage of the investigation. They were excluded from further prosecution because any further inquiry would have resulted in their testimonies against much higher-ranking officials.
Meanwhile, Gargarinsky District Court ruled that modest-income employees like courier Alexander Amelichev, accountant Tatiana Kozlova, and Vyacheslav Sinaisky were to pay the state 5.15 billion rubles to compensate for the stolen taxes.
I don't believe in the Russian judiciary. I understand that this case was simply framed up in a familiar manner. The Magnitsky investigation revealed that. We have all read these documents. What else can we say? There is no justice in this country. Therefore, we cannot really say anything more about this case.
So what happened to the officials? The former head of the Federal Tax Service of Russia, Anatoly Serdyukov, is enjoying freedom as usual. The former head of the Federal Tax Service Moscow Directorate, Nadezhda Sinikova, is a top manager at the state company Rosoboronpostavka. The former head of Moscow Inter-District Tax Service Directorate number 28, Olga Stepanova, lives happily in her villa in Dubai. Sergei Zhemchuznikov, former deputy head of the Moscow Inter-District Tax Service Directorate number 25, who signed the criminal orders on behalf of his former boss, Elena Kamina, is now in charge of Moscow Inter-District Tax Service Directorate number 10.